My brother's truck was blocking the end of the driveway when I pulled in, and I remember thinking that was strange, because I hadn't told anyone we were coming up that weekend. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the lake. The water was doing that thing it does in late September in Muskoka, where it goes completely still in the morning and looks like something you could walk across. I had been driving for 3.5 hours from Toronto. I had a backseat full of groceries, a bottle of wine I'd been saving, and a folder in my bag that I had put together months ago and hadn't thought about since, because I genuinely believed I would never need it. I got out of the car and started carrying bags toward the door. I want to go back a little, because none of this makes sense without the context, and the context matters more than the confrontation. The confrontation lasted maybe 40 minutes. What led to it took 7 years. My parents got married 45 years ago in a church in Barrie that no longer exists. They were 23 and 24 years old, and they had, by their own telling, approximately nothing. My dad drove a delivery truck. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office. They saved like people who understood in their bones that nothing was guaranteed, and by the time my brother and I were in school, they had a small house in Innisfil and a routine that never varied and a kind of quiet contentment that I didn't fully appreciate until I was old enough to understand how rare it actually is. I am 31 years old. I work in financial planning, which my dad always calls the money job with a pride that embarrasses him a little. I am not wealthy. I am careful. There is a difference, and I learned it from watching my parents. My brother is 36. He is charming and scattered and has always moved through life slightly faster than he can afford to. He married his wife 6 years ago, and she is the kind of woman who enters a room and immediately begins calculating what is in it. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as an observation. I have watched her do it at Christmas dinners and birthday parties and family BBQs, and the calculation is always running somewhere behind her eyes, quiet and persistent. She is not a bad person in the way that makes the news. She is a bad person in the way that is very easy to miss until it's too late. The cottage was my idea, and it was entirely mine. I want to be clear about that, not because I need credit for it, but because it matters to what happened later. My parents had always talked about getting a place on the water. It was one of those things that lived in the background of every summer vacation, every long weekend, every time we drove through cottage country, and my mother would say someday in that tone that meant she didn't actually believe it would happen. They had never been able to make the numbers work. Property prices in Muskoka had spent the last 20 years doing what property prices in Muskoka do, which is climb in a way that makes you feel personally targeted. 4 years ago, I started a fund. I didn't tell anyone. I named it something boring in my spreadsheet so I would never accidentally mention it, and I added to it every month the way you add to something you're not sure will ever be enough. I worked extra hours. I took on a second client roster for a year. I didn't take a vacation. I told myself that if I got to the number, I would do it, and if I didn't, I would find another way to mark the occasion. I got to the number 18 months ago. The property is on a lake about 40 minutes north of Huntsville. It is not grand. It is a 3-bedroom frame cottage with a screen porch and a proper dock and a boathouse that needed a new roof when I bought it, which I had done before the closing date. The tree line comes right down to the water on both sides. At night, it is so quiet that the first time my mother stood on the dock, she said she could hear her own heartbeat. The purchase price was $342,000. I paid it with 7 years of savings, and a small line of credit I had already paid off by the time this story reaches its worst moment. The land transfer tax in Ontario on a property at that price is not insignificant, and I paid that too, because I had planned for it. I had a real estate lawyer handle the title. I put the property in my parents' names as joint tenants with right of survivorship, which means if one of them passes, the other inherits automatically without going through an estate. I also had the lawyer register a restrictive covenant on title, a legal condition attached to the land itself that prohibits any short-term rental listing without written consent of all named owners. I listed myself as a third owner with a 1% interest, which in Ontario gives me legal standing to enforce that covenant. I did not do any of this, because I suspected my brother would try to profit from a gift I hadn't given yet. I did it because I work in financial planning, and I know what family property disputes look like, and I believe in the same thing my parents taught me, which is that love and preparation are not opposites. They are, in the right circumstances, the same thing. I told my parents on their anniversary in August. I drove them up on a Friday afternoon, told them we were going to dinner somewhere new, watched my mother try to figure out why we were heading north instead of toward town. When we turned down the gravel road and she saw the water through the trees, she asked me where we were going. When I parked and handed my dad the keys, she covered her mouth with both hands and didn't speak for almost 2 minutes. My dad walked straight to the dock. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the water for a long time. Then he turned around and looked at me like he was trying to understand something. He said, "How did you do this?" not accusatory, like a person who genuinely cannot do the arithmetic and needs someone to explain it. I told him I had been saving. He nodded slowly, the way he nods when he is taking something in that is bigger than he expected. My mother hugged me for a long time and did not say anything. I came back up 2 weekends later and stocked the pantry and the boathouse. I set up their internet. I framed a photo of the dock at sunset and hung it in the front hallway. I did not invite my brother. Not because I was trying to exclude him, but because it was not his moment. And I think somewhere I knew, even if I didn't let myself think it clearly, that his presence would change the temperature of the room. I told him about it at Thanksgiving in October. He gave me a hug and said it was incredible and that our parents were so lucky. His wife said very little. I noticed that, but I filed it away somewhere small and moved on. That brings me back to September of this year, which is now, and to the truck in the driveway. I carried the grocery bags to the door and knocked, which felt strange because I had a key, but the truck made me cautious. My mother opened the door and there was something wrong in her face, not fear exactly. Something more like the expression of a person who has been waiting for someone to come and is relieved it is finally happening. "You came up," she said, and her voice was careful. "Surprise trip," I said. I looked past her into the kitchen. My brother was at the table with a coffee. His wife was standing near the window with her arms crossed and her phone in her hand. She was smiling the particular smile she uses when she is several moves ahead of a conversation. My dad was sitting in the armchair by the wood stove. His hands, which have been steady my entire life, were resting on his knees and moving slightly, the way hands do when they cannot be still. I set the grocery bags down on the counter. I said hello to everyone. My brother said hey and asked if I wanted coffee. I said sure. His wife said it was nice that I had driven all the way up, and the way she said it suggested she was surprised I had the nerve to show up at all. I did not understand that yet. I was still catching up. We sat down. My brother did most of the talking in the beginning. He said something about how beautiful the property was, how it was such a waste for it to just sit empty most of the year, how he and his wife had been thinking about ways the whole family could get more value out of it. I remember the word value. It landed on the table like a stone. His wife leaned forward at that point and said they had been looking into it, and that a cottage on a Muskoka lake could generate between $1,800 and $2,500 a week on Airbnb during peak summer season. She said she had already built a draft listing because she wanted to show my parents what it could look like. She pulled out her phone and turned it toward my parents. The photos were ones I had taken. My dad said, very quietly, that he didn't know about that. His wife said that with property taxes and carrying costs, it was really the responsible thing to do, that sitting on an asset like this wasn't honoring the investment. I noticed she said investment, as if the gift had been converted in her mind into a financial instrument that now required management. My brother was nodding. Not aggressively. He always nods when his wife is talking about money, and the nodding is what makes him most difficult to be angry at, because it reads less like agreement and more like someone being moved by a current they can't see well enough to resist. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the table. I looked at my dad. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before and have not been able to stop thinking about since. It was a kind of helplessness, underneath which was something else, something older. Like a person watching something that belongs to them being described as belonging to everyone. I asked his wife when she had put the listing up. She said it wasn't live yet, that she had been waiting to have a family conversation first. Then she added that technically, since the property was in my parents' names, it was really their decision. She said this in a tone that made it clear she had already had the conversation with my parents, separately, and that my parents had been too uncomfortable to say no directly. I said I wanted to understand the plan clearly. I asked if they were planning to list the cottage for short-term rental, take a portion of the revenue for what she had called management costs, and treat the remaining income as family income. She said something to the effect that they were family, and that it wasn't unreasonable to expect the whole family to benefit from a family asset. There it was, family asset. My brother put his mug down. He looked at me and not at my parents when he said, "Look, it's on their land. They can do what they want with it, right? Nobody's trying to cut you out." I asked him what he thought would happen to the property when our parents were gone. He shrugged and said it would go to both of us, presumably. His wife nodded. I sat with that for a moment. I had spent $342,000 of my own money to give my parents a place to watch the light on the water in the years they had left, and in the space of an autumn weekend, it had become a shared inheritance that my brother's wife was already listing on a rental platform she'd photographed with my own images. I said I wanted to show them something. I went out to my car and brought in my bag. I sat back down at the table. I unzipped the bag and took out a folder. I set it on the table and opened it. The first document was the certificate of title from the Ontario Land Registry. I laid it flat so everyone could see it. My name was on it, alongside my parents', with the notation of my registered interest and the date of registration. His wife leaned forward to look at it. The smile did not disappear right away. But something behind it shifted. I said that as a registered owner, any commercial use of the property required my written consent. She said she wasn't aware I was on the title. I said I was aware she wasn't aware. The second document was the restrictive covenant, which had been registered on title at the same time as the transfer. I explained what it was. I explained that a restrictive covenant runs with the land, meaning it applies to all current and future owners, and that it cannot be removed without a court order or the written consent of all parties. I explained that our family's particular covenant explicitly prohibited short-term rental listing platforms by name. I said the lawyer had been thorough. My brother said, very quietly, "You did all this before you gave it to them?" I said yes. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at our parents. Our mother was crying quietly, not with sadness, but with the kind of relief that looks like it hurts a little. Our dad had stopped moving his hands. His wife said that this seemed like it was setting up a situation where I controlled the property and that it wasn't fair to our parents. I looked at her and said that the covenant protected our parents from exactly what she had spent the last 2 days setting up. I said it as plainly as I could, not with anger. With the same tone I use at work when I'm explaining something to a client who has been misinformed and needs someone to name what happened without dramatizing it. She said she was trying to help the family. I asked her to define family. She didn't answer. My brother said my name in a tone that meant he wanted me to stop, but I was not doing anything that needed stopping. I was sitting at a kitchen table in a cottage I had paid for, looking at a woman who had spent a weekend trying to convert my parents' retirement gift into a revenue stream for herself, and I was simply being accurate about what had occurred. I took out the third document, which was a letter from the real estate lawyer who had handled the title work. It confirmed that any attempts to list the property for short-term rental without the consent of all registered owners could expose the listing party to civil liability and constitute a breach of the registered covenant. I had asked him to prepare it proactively. Again, not because I thought I'd need it, but because I believe in being complete. I set it on top of the other papers. His wife looked at the stack of documents for a long moment. Then she looked at my brother. He was staring out the window at the dock. She picked up her phone from the table and deleted the draft listing without being asked. I know she deleted it because she turned the phone toward me briefly, maybe to demonstrate compliance, maybe to communicate something else. I didn't say anything. The room was very quiet. My dad stood up from the armchair and walked to the door. He put on his jacket. He went outside and walked down to the dock. I watched him through the window. He stood at the end of it with his hands in his pockets, looking at the water the same way he had looked at it the first time he saw it, like someone who cannot quite believe they are allowed to be somewhere so still. My brother and his wife left about an hour later. He didn't say much on the way out. She said even less. He hugged my mother at the door, and she hugged him back, because that is who my mother is. And I think that is one of the things about her I have always admired and occasionally wanted to gently shake her for. After they left, my mother and I sat on the screen porch with tea, and she told me, in pieces, what had happened over the 2 days before I arrived. His wife had come up with the idea of the listing. My brother had gone along because he always goes along. My parents had said they needed to think about it, which his wife had interpreted as an opening rather than a hesitation. She had shown them projections. She had talked about property taxes, about maintenance, about the cost of keeping a place like this running. She had framed my parents' discomfort as naivety about the realities of property ownership. My mother said she had felt, by the end of Friday night, that the cottage had already stopped being a gift and started being a burden, and she hadn't known how to say that out loud. I told her it was not a burden. She said she knew that. She said she had known it all along, and that knowing it and being able to hold on to it when someone is talking very fast about money and responsibility are sometimes different things. We sat there for a while without talking. The lake was doing the evening thing by then, going copper and then gray, and the sound of it was the same sound it always is, patient and even and not concerned with any of what had just happened. I went and stood on the dock with my dad before it got dark. He didn't look at me right away. We just stood there, listening. Eventually, he said he was sorry that it had happened. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He said he should have spoken up on Friday night, and I said I understood why it was hard. He said that was not an excuse. I said I knew that too. After a while, he said, "You planned all of this. The documents, the covenant." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You knew something might go wrong." I said I didn't know. I said I had hoped not, but I told him what I believe, which is that taking care of someone means taking care of the thing you're giving them, and that a gift with no protection is sometimes just an invitation for someone else to take it. He nodded, the same slow nod from the first day. Then he said something I keep thinking about. He said, "You know what your mother and I taught you that I'm most proud of?" I waited. He said, "That you didn't have to learn any of this the hard way." We stayed on the dock until the light was completely gone from the water. My brother called me 3 days later. He said he was sorry, and the apology was genuine enough that I accepted it, though I understood it was also partly the apology of a man who had seen what I had in that folder and understood that a different version of events could have gone very badly for him. I did not say that. I thanked him for calling. His wife has not called. I am not expecting her to. I do not need her to. The cottage is still in my parents' names, alongside mine. The covenant is still on title. The listing does not exist anywhere. My parents went up by themselves the following weekend, and my mother called me from the dock on Saturday morning and said it was cold and perfect, and that my dad had made a fire in the wood stove, and she had read an entire book in the chair, by the window. That is what I built it for. Not for the number, not for the square footage, not for what it might be worth when everyone is gone. I built it for that phone call, for my dad standing at the end of the dock with his hands in his pockets and nothing required of him. For my mother's voice, quiet and warm, telling me about the fire and the book and the cold and the stillness of a lake in October. There is something I want to say about my brother, and I want to say it carefully because I think it matters. He is not the villain of this story. He is a person who found himself married to someone whose relationship with other people's things is not healthy, and who does not yet have the courage to say so out loud. That is its own kind of problem, and I hope for his sake he figures it out before it costs him something he can't recover. I have said this to exactly one person, and I am saying it here because I think these stories often flatten people into categories they don't quite fit, and I have no interest in flattening my brother. His wife is a different matter, and I will say less about her because I have already said what needs to be said. What I will say is this. When I started that fund 4 years ago, I did not know exactly what it was going to become. I knew I wanted to do something, and I knew I wanted it to last, and I knew that the things that last are the ones that are built carefully. That is true of cottages, and it is true of relationships, and it is true of the legal registration of property titles. It is also true of families. A boundary is not a wall. I kept thinking about that on the drive back to the city, watching the highway open up south of Barrie and the landscape flatten out from rock and tree into the long, pale fields before Toronto. A boundary is not a wall. A wall keeps people out. A boundary says, this is what this thing is, and this is what it is not, and the difference matters. My parents' cottage is their home. It is a place where my dad can stand on a dock and watch the light go out of the sky and not be anywhere else. That is what it is. What it is not is a financial instrument, a revenue source, a family asset to be divided and listed and projected and managed. It was never going to be that. I had made sure of it before anyone knew it existed. And the folder is still in my bag, in the front pocket, in case it turns out I ever need to say so again.